Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Our subject is terrorism and what can be done to combat it. Shockingly, by far the greatest terrorism campaign in the world today is being run by the Obama administration, not by Al-Qaeda and those associated organizations that the U.S. government declared war on 12 years ago. It's part of the U.S. policies pursued by the Obama administration, which has plagued the world with war and destruction. Not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of a tiny American economic elite, the 1%, who've gotten 95% of the income gains of the Obama years. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's the 13th week of 2014. A week in which the Obama administration tried to distract Americans from their own war-making, which most Americans disapprove of, by hysterical charges against Russian political moves on their own borders. We'll talk about that tonight with commentaries from Ron Zoke, Standing Up to Vlad the Bad, Deborah Johnson, U.S. media ignores drone strikes, and Deb may also mention some other things that the U.S. media has been ignoring, and perhaps a commentary as well by Karen Evans-Levy. We'll conclude with some videos of some remarkable conversations that have been published, apparently by the Russian Secret Service, by American officials and the officials that we're sponsoring in Ukraine and Estonia. U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, most of them civilians. Martin Luther King called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And that is still true today, when the U.S. spends more on war each year not only than Russia and China, but more than all the other countries of the world combined. And the U.S. has almost 1,000 military bases around the world in some 150 of the world's 200 countries. President Obama, who was elected because he promised change, has continued the war-making of his predecessors, often with the same administration officials, and he simply lied about it because he knows that 3 out of 4 Americans oppose America's war-making. Obama is carrying out the most extreme global campaign of terror in the world today. The drone campaign is simply a terrorist campaign. It's an assassination campaign. The former head of the CIA, Michael Hayden, recently conceded that there isn't a single country in the world that accepts U.S. legal justification for the campaign except for Israel and Afghanistan. And he's probably wrong about Afghanistan. The president of Afghanistan has had some remarkable things to say in the last week and so. It's recognized at the highest level that the American assassination campaign is simply radicalizing the population and creating more people who want revenge, more people whom we call terrorists. But because of President Obama's intense propaganda and the shameful cooperation of the American media, which was particularly on display this week, I think, most Americans don't know the extent of the war that the U.S. brought to the rest of the world. In our recent anti-war demonstrations in Champaign and Urbana, the most frequently asked questions are, what war? And by those a bit better informed, which war? Aware, our local anti-war group, has been around for 12 years, since the 9/11 attacks, when a number of people in Champaign-Urbana, like people in local communities around the country, saw that the U.S. government would use the 9/11 crimes as an excuse to carry on and expand its decades-long war for the control of Middle East energy resources. And our friends also saw that the traditional political parties, Democrat and Republican, would both cave in to the U.S. government's war-making strategy, which remains essentially the same whether Republicans or Democrats are in office. Today, the U.S. government is threatening, invading, occupying, and subverting countries around the world, particularly in a vast circle around the Middle East, which the U.S. military calls, revealingly enough, Central Command. This region has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and our government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars month after month to control it. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what our government demanded for more than 2 generations. We, in fact, import very little of our own oil supplies from the Mideast. Most of our imported oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of world energy supplies gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. These wars are not in the interest of 99% of Americans, only the 1% who profit from armaments and oil. In other words, President Obama is killing men, women, and children in Asia and Africa in our name because China and other countries need oil, and our government intends to have control over where they get it. President Obama's drone-driven global assassination program, by far the world's greatest terrorist campaign, is also a terror-generating campaign. The drone assassination campaigns are one device by which state policy knowingly endangers security of the U.S. public, not protected as it says it is, and the same is true of the murderous special forces operations. The Obama administration has built up what is essentially a private army, the Special Operations Command, engaged in kidnapping, they call it rendition, and assassination around the world. Some 70,000 U.S. troops in SOCOM are active in some 130 countries, according to their spokesman. They report only to the President's National Security Council. These are American death squads, which, along with drones, are the Obama administration's substitute for the ground troops deployed by the Bush administration in invasion and occupation. They produce fewer American casualties, and they keep secret, to some extent, the foreign wars of which 3 out of 4 Americans disapprove. Their mission is not fighting terrorism, but rather securing the U.S. worldwide economic empire. The Obama administration is confident that these American killers, recruited in the depths of the Great Recession, will not be as politically aware as their foreign counterparts. Why is Obama carrying on a secret global assassination campaign, which has now, with drones alone, killed perhaps 5,000 people, when it's obvious that it increases terrorism around the world? We can only conclude, hard as it is to believe, that the U.S. government wants war, even including terrorist attacks against U.S. interests and citizens. If there were no war, the U.S. would have no excuse for occupying the world's greatest energy-producing regions. Energy politics are also involved in the U.S. machinations in Ukraine, revealed in the recent overheard phone calls of Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, who was also a member of the Bush and Clinton administrations. All recent administrations have worked to extend NATO, the U.S. military alliance, to the very borders of Russia, the goal being U.S. economic control in Eastern Europe. Remember Clinton's attack on Serbia 15 years ago this week. Obama's problem is the American people, who recently stopped him from bombing Syria and may stop U.S. military action in Eastern Europe and South America. Americans don't want more war and are suffering from the administration's economic policies. But politicians, bankers, and corporations do want war, so it's clear whom Obama is working for. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it's put into practice by President Obama. And we'll begin tonight with Ron Zoke, Vlad the Bad.
Yeah, standing up to Vlad the Bad. We're told increasingly in the mainstream media by various commentators, pundits, that this is what we must do, that the USA and Barack Obama in particular are being humiliated because we're not standing up forcefully enough to the depredations of Mr. Putin, particularly in Crimea, but who knows what he'll go on to do next, invading Western Ukraine or the Baltic states, or it's horrible just thinking about what he may be up to. So a symptom of this is a recent article in the New York Times, 3 presidents and a riddle named Putin. This is one of those, well, what is he really like statements. It's being done to Barack Obama also. What is he really like? As if there's something really suspicious and ominous, but avoiding some of the more obvious accusations and insults, that is, of the obscene kind. It's a little more subtle than that. So what is Vladimir Putin really like? It's a campaign of demonization going on. The need to personalize and subjectivize everything. It's due to the evil influence. Our problems in the Russian Eastern European area are due to the evil influence of Mr. Putin himself, who's a stone cold killer, we're told. And it's due to his proclivity to evil. So these articles pronounce upon his secret intentions and motives, which are wholly malign. So he's starting to get the madman treatment that was used on, well, like Hitler and Stalin. It was used on bin Laden, on Saddam, on Gaddafi. It's a standard line, and arousing suspicion about this demonic influence. Vladimir Putin is a evil man who must be stopped. And this kind of line, of course, is kind of sub rosa warmongering, although warmongers hate to have this said about themselves, but it degenerates quickly into personal slander. And how this is done is typically by association. This is a mark of popular thinking in all of its ignorance and confusion, to operate by association rather than by inference, because the inferences cannot be justified. They cannot be supported at all. But if A makes you think of B and B makes you think of C, and then you can go around saying, well, that reminds me of this and that, and so on. And maybe nobody will challenge that. So this is about how Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama reacted when they met Putin. And each of the three presidents, this says, tried in his own way to forge a historic, if elusive new relationship with Russia, only to find their efforts torpedoed by the wiry martial arts master and former KGB colonel. They imagined him to be something he was not, or assumed that they could manage a man who refuses to be managed. They saw him through their own lens, believing he viewed Russia's interests as they thought he should, and they underestimated his deep sense of grievance. So Putin is carrying around this sense of grievance against the West, and all of this, of course, frequently references the West with a capital W, and who do you think that means?
Yeah, who's that?
Right. So remember who the West is. It may be that some of the policies are contributing to Mr. Putin's discontent, whether it's by NATO expansion, the Iraq War, or the Libya War. But in the end, they said, these three presidents, ex-presidents, that they were dealing with a Russian leader fundamentally at odds with the West. So we've been warned that Mr. Putin is personally fundamentally at odds with the West. Quoting, I know there's been some criticism on, was the reset ill-advised? This is the term used by Obama. We're going to reset Russian policy since the end of the Cold War. This is quoting Mr. Donilon's statement, using the Obama administration's term for its policy. No, the reset wasn't ill-advised. The reset resulted in direct accomplishments that were the interests of the United States. So the reset notion is being ridiculed in the right-wing and neocon press. we let the belief that a reset was possible, a détente with Russia, we let that belief overshadow Putin's stated goal of revising a post-Cold War settlement in which Moscow lost control over significant territory and watched as the West expanded its domain. So presidents like to think of autocrats like Mr. Putin as fellow statesmen, said Dennis Blair, Mr. Obama's first director of national intelligence. They should think of dictators like they think of domestic politicians of the other party, he said, opponents who smile on occasion when it suits their purposes and cooperate when it is to their advantage, but who are at heart trying to push the U.S. out of power, will decap the United States if they get the chance, and will go along only if the U.S. has more power than they. So this is another reading of what's really in the demon Putin's heart. They are at heart trying to push the U.S. out of power, and of course we can't tolerate that. So we must defend American interests there. We can't appear to be weak or make any compromises. In fact, we're told those efforts have ordinarily invariably been taken as weakness, so we have to stand strong and show that we are tough, ballsy, macho he-man who are going to stand up to Mr. Putin. This goes back to the days of Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, when he appointed Putin his successor, and some of little-known stuff about Yeltsin. From Bill Clinton, I came away from the meeting believing Yeltsin had picked a successor who had the skills and capacity for hard work necessary to manage Russia's turbulent problems. Mr. Clinton wrote, but we found out that given his health problems, which was alcoholism primarily, Mr. Clinton wrote in his memoir, that turned out to be not the case, and we didn't know what a demon, a monster Mr. Putin was at heart. Not everyone was convinced when Mr. Bush's vice president, Dick Cheney, privately told people at the time that when he saw Mr. Putin, I think KGB, KGB, KGB. So that's his association. Mr. Bush was determined to erase the historical divide and courted Mr. Putin during the Russian leader's visits to Camp David and Mr. Bush's Texas ranch. So this was very naive. Mr. Putin liked to brag, see, he's a braggart, that he was the first foreign leader to call Mr. Bush after the attacks of September 11, 2001. And he permitted American troops into Central Asia as a base of operations against Afghanistan. So it goes on and on in this vein. More of it is coming from the old neocons who gave us the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and are coming back into prominence now. It's amazing the way on the evening news the old professional anti-communists are being wheeled out again and making their pronouncements about a supposed new Cold War, and we're being told that we must not be humiliated by the Russians, that we must stand up to them. So article by, in the Wall Street Journal by Niall Ferguson, professor of history at Harvard, America's Global Retreat. Never mind the Fed's taper. This says it's the U.S. geopolitical taper that is stirring wild world anxiety from Ukraine to Syria to the Pacific. A hands-off foreign policy invites more trouble. So be tough, Obama, and remember that the only thing those foreign enemies understand is force. So make sure that you insist that military action is always on the table. Meanwhile, New York Times again, March 7th, London's laundry business. Someone is extremely indignant about the failure of the British investing and banking class to stand up to the Russians. it boils down to this author says, Ben Judah, Britain is ready to betray the United States to protect the City of London's hold on dirty Russian money and forget about Ukraine. Britain, open for business, no longer has a mission. Any moralizing remnant of the British Empire is gone. It has turned back to the pirate England of Sir Walter Raleigh. Britain's ruling class has decayed to the point where its first priority is protecting its cut of Russian money, even as Russian armored personnel characters rumble around in the streets of Sebastopol. But the establishment understands that in the 21st century, what matters are banks, not tanks. And so on. Well, I'll come back to some of the other things that you will find only outside the mainstream media. Another group of articles that you can find if you know where to look. What the neocons want from the Ukraine crisis, what the U.S. media won't tell you about Ukraine. The looting of Ukraine has begun, and how U.S. disregard for international law set the stage for the Crimean crisis. It's really funny. I mean, people are rolling on the floor laughing when American representatives get indignant about Russians violating international law. But we can come back to that if there's time. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. Deb, you've got a comment on what Ron has just set out here. There's an awful lot of dangerous nonsense, I think,
yes,
as Ron points out.
On the media itself, I mean, these gentlemen, these women who report the news aren't even journalists anymore. I mean, I think they're given an ideology and they have to spew that on the news. So, I mean, if you really want to find what's really happening, you've got to go to independent media, and because what you're listening to on the major networks is propaganda.
All true. And may I point out a slight error that our usually infallible producer and director is taking care of, takes care of us here. That's Deborah Johnson commenting on the matter. Our friend Karen Aram, who would normally be with us, is not today, but we're happy to have Deborah here, and we'll have Karen back in the near future, I think. While we're on personal peak, let me mention one. Niall Ferguson has got to be one of the worst examples of academic charlatanism I have seen in a long time. And I'm old enough to have seen a good number of academic charlatans going back a long way, including an association with his present institution, the history department at Harvard University, which I was seduced into as a young man and watched in horror over the years as it continued to be an embarrassing source of miseducation on American politics, and harbored some of the most dangerous and inadequate commentators on American history and politics. It is an embarrassment, really, to that institution, and Niall Ferguson caps the lot. He's really a bad guy, and the nonsense that he's speaking about this, which, as you rightly say, Ron, is part and parcel of the neocon line that we've been hearing for many years in this country, is about as objectionable as it can be.
Do you go back to the days of Oscar Handlin? Or,
oh yes,
or Samuel Wave the Flag Bemis?
Oh yes, indeed, yes. That was, as they say, I could tell you stories. But no, it's unfortunate. It really is that Ferguson has the perch that he does, because what he has to say is so awful, and it's worthwhile to call him out here on Aware on the Air. We'll talk about other things that are being done badly in terms of getting an account of the politics that produce the wars that we as Americans are responsible for. Deb is going to talk a little about our present president's great enthusiasm, drone strikes.
Well, this comes from dispatches from the underclass amplifying the voices of the voiceless. It's basically a drone. It's basically a blog. And it was written by Rania Khalik on March 17th. And it's titled, U.S. Media Ignores 7 U.S. Drone Strikes on Yemen in First 12 Days of March. We already know that ignoring America's extrajudicial killings of unnamed brown people halfway across the world is uninteresting to most U.S. media outlets. But this month, the establishment press has really outdone itself. On March 2nd, a U.S. drone strike slammed into a vehicle parked near the town of Shebwan in the Marib province of Yemen, reducing the car and its 2 occupants to rubble. This due process-free assassination of a suspected militant sleeping in his car kicked off a series of U.S. drone strikes across Yemen over the next 10 days, most of which have been entirely ignored by the U.S. media. Fortunately, details about each drone strike can be found at the Bureau of Investigation Journalism, which keeps a running list of U.S. drone strikes as they happen. On March 7th, a suspected U.S. drone strike killed 15 people. 15 people. That's not to say that drone strikes are excusable as long as only a handful of people are killed, just that 15 people is really a high number that at the very least warrants further investigation by news outlets that possess the resources to do so. But to strike, as far as I can tell, not a single U.S. or Western media outlet has bothered to even report on this strike. The same goes for a drone killing carried out days later. According to the Yemen Times, the target of the drone strike that incinerated a vehicle on March 10th was a 16-year-old boy whose loved ones have also been targeted by drones. Quote, Abad Abdullah al-Shabwani, a young man from the al-Shabwan tribe in Wadi Abida, was killed in the strike, according to Brigadier Abdul Khalik Mohammed Salih, the operations director of the 3rd Military Region in Marib. Salah said al-Shabwani was a militant, excuse me, was a militant with suspected ties to Al-Qaeda. Al-Shabwani's relatives denied his involvement in the group and told Yemen Times that 16-year-old friends and relatives has also been targeted by drone strikes. Mujad Jabir al-Shabwani, from the same tribe as Abad and a friend of Abad's, according to relatives, was also attacked by drones in the same area in which Monday's incident happened. Mujad Jabir Abjawani, from the same tribe as Obad and a friend of Obad's, according to relatives, was killed on March 3rd by an American drone in the same area in which Monday's incident took place. If this is true, the U.S. murdered a child for suspected links to Al-Qaeda based on evidence no one, except for President Obama and his inner circle, is allowed to see. Meanwhile, the local community is living in a constant state of terror as they struggle to cope with possible death from the sky and the presence of Al-Qaeda on the ground, who I imagine have an easier time recruiting new fighters in the aftermath of U.S. bombings that kill children. But don't expect to hear about this from mainstream U.S. outlets anytime soon. They're far too busy obsessing over Russia's invasion of Crimea because a foreign government's violation of international law is far more newsworthy than possible war crimes being committed by one's own government.
Absolutely.
So that is a really worthwhile blog to check out. Again, dispatches from the underclass, amplifying the voice of the the voices of the voiceless.
Thank you, Deb. Reaction, Ron?
No, I'll pass.
Well, it seems to me that it's important to realize what's happened here in terms of the war fighting of this administration. Obama, after all, became president precisely because he was very good as a sort of lawyer for a guilty defendant, right? His job was to make palatable the wretched war that he inherited, surely, but embraced when he inherited it, and then had to deal with the fact that it was substantially unpopular with the American populace. Obama knows perfectly well that he became president precisely because he co-opted the anti-war movement that objected to his predecessor, George Bush, and used that for his campaign. He did this basically by lying about what his policy was going to be. When he came into office, most of the people who voted for him expected him to embrace a policy that would remove America from the Middle East wars. After all, that's what the campaign had been about. Whereas his opponent in 2008, John McCain, had said, of course, we have to expand and increase those wars. Seemed a straightforward decision. Well, in office, of course, what Obama did was expand and increase those wars and look for new and lethal ways to do it. And he did a second thing, which was, I think, in retrospect, if there are any historians around in a generation to look back and figure out what's going on, what was going on here, they will be impressed by this, the way he got it out of the consciousness of Americans. Now, of course, he had tremendous support from the American media in doing this. The news hole, as they say in the media, which was filled with war talk in the Bush administration, suddenly closed up on war talk in the Obama administration. We just didn't hear about it. Most Americans don't know that Barack Obama massively increased American troop commitments to Afghanistan and intended to follow up and expand the Bush administration war in Iraq. Most Americans don't know, even if they've heard of the drones that are not being mentioned in the media, as Deb points out, even if they'd heard of the drones, they're not aware that Obama has killed more than 5,000 people with drone strikes, at least 200 of them children, according to the careful figures kept by the group that Deb mentioned, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London. These numbers are not kept by American media. They're not kept by the American government. The American government doesn't talk about, oh, they probably are, but they aren't publicized by the American government. The American government knows pretty well how many people it's killed. Obama knows how many people he has killed. In fact, in a book published earlier this year, he's quoted as saying to aides that he's gotten very good at killing people. And it's true, he did. At least 5,000 by drones alone. And drones are only part of the global assassination program that Obama has substituted for the boots on the ground warfare of the Bush administration. It's been pointed out that the history of American imperial war around the world, down to the Obama administration, shows some consistent patterns. For example, more than 30 years ago, when Ronald Reagan became president, Ronald Reagan modeled his presidency on that of John Kennedy, and immediately decided that what he should attack, as John Kennedy had attacked Southeast Asia, he, Ronald Reagan, and when I speak of Ronald Reagan here, I mean, of course, the people who are doing his thinking for him, the people around him. When you speak of a president, you're always doing that. That they should attack Central America the same way Kennedy had attacked Southeast Asia. But the residue of the Vietnam War by the early 1980s was such that they couldn't do it openly. They couldn't send bombers to Central America the way Kennedy had sent bombers to Southeast Asia. They couldn't carpet bomb Nicaragua the way that Kennedy carpet bombed Vietnam. And the result was to drive the Reagan war policy underground. They started the so-called Contra War, and the history of the Reagan administration as war in the Central America is remarkably similar to the covert war that Barack Obama is carrying on right now. This way of making war so the American people don't really have to notice it is in some sense a heritage of the Vietnam days, when finally the opposition to what the government was doing, what our government was doing in Southeast Asia, grew to such a point that it drove essentially 2 presidents from office. Now, Obama knows this history very well. He's written about it, as a matter of fact, and he wants to be very clear that his war in Southwest Asia does not repeat the dire consequences for the presidency that the war in Southeast Asia did a generation earlier. That's why the complacent media tells us so little about what's going on. Let me take a couple examples just from this last week. The principal theater, as it's a word he uses himself, of Obama's war in the Middle East has been Afghanistan. And last week, in this past week, the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, supported Russia's annexation of Crimea, saying the referendum on its future reflected the people's free will to decide their future. Now, that's in fact what most of the world thinks, but this is our man in Kabul, eh? This is Hamid Karzai, who owes his job to the United States, the man who's supposed to be running Afghanistan for us. And he's biting the hand that feeds him here. It was Lincoln's Secretary of War who said an honest politician is one who stays bought. Well, the U.S. bought Karzai about as clearly as they could, and he's not staying bought. Karzai traveled to Sochi for the Winter Olympics when many European heads of states boycotted the ceremony, and Russia is starting to put money back into Afghanistan as foreign troops leave. The U.S. says it's leaving, and indeed some of its NATO forces have been withdrawn. The Russians are retooling a factory and setting up relationships with the Afghan government. The Afghan government is coming up to an election in which Hamid Karzai cannot succeed himself, and the Russians are dealing with this Afghan government, which is supposed to be an American creation. What Karzai has to say in this circumstance tells us a good bit about the real nature of American policy in the region. In one of the few newspaper interviews that Karzai has done in recent weeks, he said he believed that the U.S.-led occupation of his country was, quote, not in Afghanistan's interest, and has led to many Afghan deaths for a war that was not their own. Now, that's pretty far from the American excuse about how we're defending the good people of Afghanistan from these terrible terrorists who are tearing them apart. Karzai, our creature, says, no, that's not what it was about at all. That's not what we were doing. Karzai says he believes the war was primarily in the U.S. government's interest and continued despite the threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan being, quote, more a myth than a reality. Independent observers have said that for a long time, but this is the president of Afghanistan saying it. Karzai also reiterated his opposition to signing the bilateral security agreement, saying it was something the U.S. should simply take up with his successor, the new president of Afghanistan, at this point. Karzai's term ends next month. The bilateral security agreement, as presently written, would keep U.S. troops on the ground in Afghanistan through 2024 and beyond. Now, that's what the Obama administration is trying to arrange with the Afghanistan government, while Obama is saying to you that the war is winding down and we're going to withdraw by the end of 2014. It's a flat-out lie in terms of their own plans, the Obama administration's own plans, and the only embarrassment here from their point of view is that President Karzai says so. President Karzai also refuses to sign this bilateral security agreement, saying a problem similar to the problem the Obama administration had in Iraq. So what is actually going on in Obama's war making is very far from what Obama says is going on with it, and very far from what the American media are repeating on it. The reason we do this program is to try to talk about the real war that the United States is fighting, and this is a central theme within that war. You're listening to Aware on the Air. Comments, ladies and gentlemen?
I forgot to mention, as a parallel, Vladimir Putin is by far the most popular person in Russia, and his popularity has increased enormously since the Crimea affair. It's really shot up.
While Obama's has declined.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's also important to think, I think, while we talk about these European leaders, Chancellor Merkel in Germany and the others, Cameron and Hollande and whatnot, it's important to remember that of the G7, G8 countries, by far the most popular leader is Vladimir Putin. None of the leaders of the other countries has anywhere near the support domestically, support at home, that he has, even though he has some very real opposition, and even though his background would suggest that there would be very good reasons that a Russian Democrat, lowercase d, would oppose the policies of the Russian government. But this
Another
is
minor point, article on Fox News, you might expect. A safe, secure Afghanistan is within our grasp. Don't let it slip away. This is going back to February 24th by Representative Howard Buck McKeon. And it comes down to just give us 6 more months. How many times have we heard that? And a few thousand more men, and we'll wrap it up. And
Right.
Afghanistan will remain within our grasp.
incredible, absolutely incredible.
It's almost as if they're trying to create realities that they want you to, to believe in,
Exactly.
And what's really happening is something totally different.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yes,
There have
I
been
think that's
commentators who've been saying that Washington's elite circles are just pervaded by wishful and magical thinking.
Yeah,
lost contact with reality.
I would see it a little differently, Ron. I mean, I'm not. That may well be true. You could probably find plenty of wishful and magical thinking in Washington. But at the heart of Washington, at the heart of the amongst the policymakers, the people who are actually making American policy, and who actually stay on from time to time. It was, I think. It was important to notice that Victoria Newlands, whom you talked about in a wonderful commentary a couple of weeks ago on Victoria's Secret, Victoria Newlands has indifferently served the Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations in the State Department, doing the same things, following the same policies as presidents come and go. Now, this is a commonplace, but we sometimes forget it, I think, in this country, that American policy is consistent over time and really doesn't matter whether there's a Republican or Democrat in office. The second point about that I think is important is the notion that American policy sometimes looks capricious, silly, stupid. They don't know what they're doing. They're just messing around there. I don't think that's right. I think they want you to believe that occasionally, but I think that American policy is remarkably consistent and remarkably rational in the traditional sense of rationality, a matter of fitting means to ends. American policy, the reason American policy looks different from what it actually is that the policymakers don't want to admit to the American people exactly what they're doing, because they know they would oppose it. And therefore they have to cover sin with smooth names. They have to pretend the U.S. is fighting for freedom and doing good things around the world, if occasionally making some blunders and some mistakes. That doesn't describe it at all, although that certainly is the standard way of America looking at it. American policy the American media is looking at it. American policy is remarkably consistent over time. It pursues the same goals and varies sometimes the instrumentalities, the means they use to those goals, but are mainly involved in masking from the American populace what it is they're doing and why. And the Crimean affair seems to me to be a wonderful example of this, as we've been trying to point out in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, another interesting parallel point going back a couple of steps in what you were saying, the invasion of Grenada by the Reagan administration in October 1983. Within a few days of the attack on the barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, in which over 200 Americans were killed.
I mentioned earlier that this week is the 15th anniversary of another attack on a Slavic country by a Democratic president in the United States. That is Bill Clinton's bombing campaign against Serbia. Now, we're far enough away from that now, 15 years, that if we remember it at all, and of course the primary effort of American media and the American government is to have us not remember it at all. I bet if we walked out on the street and asked people if they remember Clinton's bombing campaign against Serbia, we may get 1 in 10 who would recall it. But the justification at the time was that we were defending Kosovo. In fact, what the U.S. was doing and what the U.S. Government officials who were in charge of the campaign, notably Strobe Talbot, eventually admitted was that they were reducing a country that was not playing by the neoliberal rules that Europe in general was being incorporated into. That country was Serbia. And that the attack on Serbia for maltreating a region that was part of Serbia, something that has parallels obviously with what's going on in Russia right now, was made up. Was made up precisely to punish Serbia and bring down the all too economically independent Serbian government, which it did. So it's the patterns here remain very much the same. What we have to cut through is the smog of misrepresentation that is so seriously abetted by the American media. Now, Deb, you mentioned before we started one extremely important issue just this week in which the media seems to me to have helped the Obama administration
Yes.
fudge entirely.
Yes, the Nuclear Security Summit being held the 24th and 25th of March, yesterday and today,
Right.
at The Hague, Netherlands. And basically, it's a summit for reduction of nuclear material. And the United States was the one that originally began this summit where worldwide leaders would get together and talk about the reduction, but in reality, we have actually increased our nuclear ideas, and we're doing exactly the opposite of what we said we were going to do within this security summit. So I don't have the exact article with me, but I thought that was very interesting to mention because we seem to begin things, making the world think that we're on the bandwagon of doing things, and then the reality of it is another thing.
Exactly. And I mean,
It seems to be standard American policy at this point.
I think you're absolutely right. It's hard to imagine a more important topic in the world at large today than nuclear security. I mean, the notion that nuclear weapons have gone away, of course, is nonsense. More and more countries have them, and although the administration occasionally tries to scare you about terrorists getting their hands on them, of course, terrorists have their hands on them already, including the United States government.
That's right.
And so it would be a topic, you would think, that would be of the first importance, but it got buried in the American media and indeed in the American government's, in the Obama administration's practice by Vlad the Bad, by the Crimean
And also
business.
of the missing airplane. I don't
yes.
have corporate
Right.
media at my house, but from what I understand, they're just beating that story to death. And It just seems to be a cover story for other things that they probably should be talking about.
And there's one last point I'd like to make about this, that if we really were talking about what the United States is actually doing, rather than being bemused by this fog of misrepresentation by the government and the media, if we were actually talking about what the U.S. was actually doing, we might find that there were peculiar alliances, peculiar positions taken by American political types. For example, as Obama says he's winding down the war and in fact encouraging belligerence against Russia, we have from the right of American politics, and raises some questions about whether we can talk about the right and the left in American politics at all. We have things like this from Patrick Buchanan, who's been identified with the political right for some time, and not unreasonably. Buchanan writes, with Vladimir Putin's dispatch of Russian troops into Crimea, our war hawks are breathing fire. Russophobia is rampant, and the op-ed pages are ablaze here. Barack Obama should tune them out and reflect on how Cold War presidents dealt with far graver clashes with Moscow. Now, this is not some lefty. This is not even the left wing of the Democratic Party, if there is such a thing, talking here. This is Patrick Buchanan, a member of Reagan's administration and a longtime spokesman for the Republican right. Buchanan writes, when Red Army Tank Division crushed the Hungarian freedom fighters in 1956, killing 50,000, Eisenhower did not lift a finger. When Khrushchev built the Berlin Wall, JFK went to Berlin and gave a speech. When Warsaw Pact troops crushed the Prague Spring in 1968, LBJ did nothing. When Moscow ordered General Jaruzelski to smash Solidarity, Ronald Reagan refused to put Warsaw in default. Now, what he's referring to here is the arrangement that actually came out of the Second World War of the spheres of influence between the U.S. and the USSR, which both sides observed until the ending of the USSR. These presidents saw no vital U.S. interest imperiled in these Soviet actions, however brutal. They sensed that time was on our side in the Cold War, and history has proven them right. We can argue about that, but this is, once again, Patrick Buchanan. What is the U.S. vital interest in Crimea? Zero. From Catherine the Great to Khrushchev, the peninsula belonged to Russia. The people of Crimea are 60% ethnic Russians. And should Crimea vote to secede from Ukraine, he wrote this before Crimea voted to secede from Ukraine, upon what moral ground will we stand to deny them the right when we bombed Serbia for 78 days to bring about the secession of Kosovo? Across Europe, nations have been breaking apart since the end of the Cold War. Out of the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia became 24 nations. Scotland is voting on secession this year. Catalonia may be next. And Pat doesn't mention my favorite example, Venice, which has just voted by about the same percentage as Crimea to dissociate from the rest of Italy. Yet today we have the Wall Street Journal describing Russia's sending of soldiers to occupy airfields in Ukraine as a, quote, blitzkrieg that, quote, brings the threat of war to the heart of Europe. Though Crimea is east even of what we used to call Eastern Europe, says. No. The point is here that the real politics of the Obama administration's war policy need to be discussed in this country, and it's not being, and it's not an accident that it's not being discussed. When we have people like this saying things like this, people like Patrick Buchanan pointing out the falseness of the administration's propaganda about its war policy in general and its policy towards Russia and Ukraine particularly, we're in trouble. The real story of how the U.S. promoted revolution, if that's what it was, in Ukraine, and the U.S. use of the activities of the Russian government in order to expand its own economic and military stature in Europe at large. That's what we should be talking about. But unfortunately, we're not. We try to here at Aware on the Air, but we're a still small voice, perhaps, in the American media. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. Concluding comments, friends?
No, I think we ought to go to the videos if we're going to get them in.
Okay, we have two. What we'll try to do here is show you the videos of these phone conversations that have been so important in the discussion recently. Remember, it's what the White House calls Terror Tuesday, the day each week when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads of the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command. The president underlings, notably CIA Director John Brennan, compiles a list of who should be executed, and the president then chooses from baseball cards who will die. The assassinations are carried out in secrecy. The administration doesn't release accounts of the people they kill. Literally thousands of men and women and children have been killed on Obama's orders. Most Americans don't know that the U.S. is running this terrorist campaign. But as Deb pointed out, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London is one of the few sources of information that tells us that Obama has killed 5,000 people with drones alone, including over 200 children. Thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett, and to Yosef, too, today, for owing to whom this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. We also want to remind you of other programs like ours here on UPTV, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org, notably on weekdays, Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. Democracy Now! And at 8 a.m. The Big Picture with Tom Hartman, which is including more and more materials from RT.com, which is one of the interesting sources of things outside the American media. At 5 p.m., Democracy Now! Is repeated here on weekdays at UPTV. Members and friends of Aware are invited to sit on this panel and participate with us in a discussion of American war making. We record at noon on Tuesdays in the Urbana City building. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zote, Karen Evans-Levy, Deborah Johnson, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.